Ever feel like being a good Christian sometimes feels like you're just checking off a list?
Yeah, I know what you mean.
Well, today we're diving into a book that flips that script completely.
Okay.
It's called DNA of a Christ Follower.
Okay.
And it starts with this really fascinating idea.
Mm-hmm.
Just like our physical DNA reveals who we are,
Mm-hmm.
there's this kind of spiritual equivalent that reveals what it really means to be a follower of Jesus.
Exactly. And it's more than just a catchy title.
Okay.
The author, who, by the way, is a pastor himself,
Okay.
he had this aha moment where he realized that even after years of leading a church,
Wow.
he'd never actually defined what a disciple is.
Okay, so let's unpack that a bit.
Mm-hmm.
If it's not just about checking off a list of good deeds, then what's the author's main point here?
Well, he argues that there's a core set of traits. You could almost think of it like a spiritual fingerprint that truly defines what it means to be a Christ follower. And here's where it gets really interesting. He challenges his readers, so that's you listening right now, to try and narrow it down to just 8.
8.
Yeah.
Wow. That is a lot harder than it sounds.
Yeah.
I mean, where do you even begin with that? The Bible's full of teachings about how we should live our lives.
Exactly. And that's the genius of it. By limiting it to just 8, it forces us to go beyond just listing virtues.
Right.
And to really get at the core DNA, you could say, of discipleship.
Yeah.
What are those absolute fundamental traits that if we really live those out, all the other stuff would naturally flow from that?
That's such a good point. It's like, what are the foundational building blocks of a life that truly reflects Christ?
Precisely. And it goes beyond just being, you know, a good person.
Right.
The author isn't aiming for some kind of generic moral ideal here.
Yeah.
He wants us to identify those specific qualities that actually reflect the very character of Jesus himself.
So it's less about achieving this kind of unattainable standard of perfection.
Yeah.
And more about understanding the real essence of what it means to be like Christ.
Exactly.
That makes a lot of sense. But how does this actually play out in the real world?
Well, that's where it gets really practical. The author sees this as a tool for personal growth, of course, but also as a way to guide pastors and shape churches into what he calls effective disciple-making communities.
That's disciple-making community.
Yeah, he's talking about churches that are focused on more than just Sunday services, but are actively equipping people to actually live out their faith in real, tangible ways.
Okay.
To become disciples who make disciples, multiplying that Christ-like DNA, so to speak.
I like it. So we're talking about moving beyond just like a surface level faith here to something that really transforms us from the inside out.
Right.
But I think some people might be thinking, well, don't we already have lists for this?
Yeah.
Like the fruits of the Spirit right there in the Bible. Why not just stick with those?
That's a great question, and actually one that the author addresses head on in the book.
Okay.
He's not saying those lists aren't valuable, not at all.
Right.
But they're not meant to be completely exhaustive either.
Okay.
The DNA metaphor, it pushes us to look for the deeper principles behind those lists. Like, what's that common thread that really connects all those virtues?
I see.
What's the underlying essence that makes all of those things genuine expressions of a Christ-centered life?
It's like we're going beyond just the symptoms.
Exactly.
And trying to get at the root cause, the DNA that's actually producing the fruit.
Exactly.
So how did the author actually go about identifying these core traits?
Yeah.
These strands of spiritual DNA, so to speak. Did he just pull them out of thin air?
No, not at all. He started by really digging deep into the New Testament, looking for every single quality that was associated with being a follower of Jesus.
Wow.
And he ended up with this huge, long list.
I bet.
And then he spent months, literally months, prayerfully narrowing it down to those 8 essential traits.
Wow. Talk about dedication.
Yeah.
But you mentioned the New Testament. Right. Does that mean that the Old Testament is totally irrelevant to understanding what it means to be a Christ follower?
Not at all. I mean, it's true that the author really focused on Jesus and the early church in his search for these core traits. Yeah. But he also recognizes that real continuity between the Old and New Testaments. In fact, he even points out that these same traits, the same spiritual DNA, you can actually see it in the lives of Old Testament figures too.
Interesting.
People who lived lives of faith and obedience even back then.
So it's like the Old Testament kind of lays the groundwork and then the New Testament comes along and reveals the full picture.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
But that same thread of faithfulness is running through both.
Exactly. And that full picture, like we've been saying, It's ultimately about becoming more like Christ himself. I mean, the DNA of a Christ follower, it's really the DNA of Jesus himself, right? It gets imprinted on our hearts through the Holy Spirit.
That's a really powerful image.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder, though, what does it actually look like?
What do you mean?
To have that DNA, that essence of Christ, woven into the fabric of our beings. How does that actually play out in our normal daily lives?
Well, that's where things get really interesting.
Okay.
And that's where we're going to explore further in the next part of our deep dive.
So we've been talking about this idea of the DNA of a Christ follower. You know, those core traits that really reflect the character of Jesus. But how do we keep it from just being theoretical? How does this actually translate into, like, really living out our faith in a way that actually makes a difference in the world around us?
That is the question, isn't it? And the author's really clear on this point. This isn't just about some sort of inward-focused piety.
Right.
It's about becoming more effective disciple makers ourselves.
There's that ripple effect idea again. It's not just about our own transformation, but about how that then impacts other people.
Exactly. And he specifically challenges pastors and church leaders to really think about how they're equipping their congregations to actually live this out.
Okay.
It's about creating a culture of discipleship that's about way more than just, going to church on Sunday.
So less about checking boxes and more about actually cultivating those spiritual fingerprints.
Yes.
That Christ-like DNA in a way that's actually visible to other people that has an impact.
Exactly. It's about allowing that transforming power of Christ to really work in us and through us to make us more like him. Yeah.
So that we can be that salt and light in the world like he talks about.
And that takes us right to the heart of this whole DNA metaphor, right?
Yeah.
It's recognizing that becoming like Christ isn't about achieving some kind of standard of behavior, some external standard.
Right.
It's got to be about a much deeper internal transformation that then works its way outward.
Absolutely. It's about those 8 core traits, those really becoming so ingrained in us, so much a part of our spiritual DNA that they just naturally flow out into everything we do.
So as we're wrapping up our deep dive into the DNA of a Christ follower, here's something I want you to think about. If these traits really are the true markers of what it means to be a follower of Christ, like the author says, how might understanding them, how might cultivating those traits in our own lives actually empower us to live out our faith in a way that not only transforms us, but also has a lasting impact on the world around us?